At 2:17 a.m., Dr. Michael Carter was halfway across the hospital parking lot when he noticed a fogged-up blue SUV parked beneath a flickering light. Inside, 3 children slept shoulder to shoulder beneath worn blankets. Paper stars hung from the ceiling like a tiny handmade sky, while a tired mother quietly stitched a torn backpack with a flashlight balanced on her knee. She never looked up. Michael stood frozen, then reached for his phone instead of his car keys. "Eleanor," he whispered when the call connected. "I think I just found someone who's trying desperately not to let her children stop dreaming. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories travel farther when people from around the world share them together. And if heartfelt stories about courage, kindness, and second chances mean something to you, we'd love to have you join our growing community." 3 years earlier, Sandra Anderson never imagined that she would one day memorize which supermarket parking lots stayed quiet after midnight, or which churches unlocked their restrooms before sunrise. Back then, her mornings began at 5:10 a.m. sharp. Her alarm never needed a second ring. She would quietly slide out of bed before the children woke, brew a small pot of coffee, toast 4 slices of wheat bread, and write tiny notes on colorful napkins that she tucked inside each lunch bag. "Be brave. You make today brighter. Mom loves you." The notes changed every morning, but the handwriting never did. Caleb, already 10 years old, collected every single one inside an old cookie tin beneath his bed. Emma liked reading hers aloud before eating lunch. Little Mason couldn't read yet, but he always kissed the folded paper because his brother told him that Mommy's words had magic inside them. Their apartment wasn't large. A modest 2-bedroom unit on the east side of Columbus overlooked a cracked basketball court where neighborhood children played until sunset. The wallpaper peeled in the hallway. The water heater complained every winter. The kitchen cabinets were older than Sandra herself, but it was home. Every corner carried evidence of love instead of luxury. On weekends, pancakes shaped like dinosaurs covered the table. Movie nights happened with blankets spread across the living room floor. Emma taped her paper artwork onto the refrigerator. Mason parked toy dinosaurs in every impossible place. Caleb carefully organized everyone's shoes near the front door because he hated clutter. Sandra loved routines. Routines made children feel safe. She had learned that from her own mother years ago. Her work reflected the same philosophy. Every weekday at exactly 6:45 a.m., Sandra entered Riverside Regional Medical Center through the employee entrance wearing neatly pressed navy blue scrubs. Most patients never knew people like her existed. Surgeons received applause. Doctors received gratitude. Nurses received flowers. Sterile processing technicians worked behind closed doors where nobody looked. Sandra didn't mind. She often smiled whenever someone called her department the invisible heartbeat of the hospital. Invisible wasn't the same as unimportant. Inside the sterilization department, every instrument had a history: scalpels, forceps, retractors, delicate surgical scissors. Thousands of tools arrived covered in the evidence of someone else's worst day. Sandra and her team made certain those instruments left cleaner than new. She inspected every hinge, every locking mechanism, every microscopic scratch. She could identify dozens of surgical trays without reading labels. Kevin Turner, who occasionally supervised training sessions between departments, once joked that Sandra could probably recognize a surgical clamp in complete darkness. She laughed. "I hope I never have to prove that." People trusted surgeons with lives. Surgeons trusted Sandra with everything they held. She carried that responsibility with quiet pride. During lunch breaks, Sandra rarely joined the crowded cafeteria. Instead, she sat outside on a small concrete bench beneath a maple tree. She called the children during their school lunch period. Did Caleb remember his math quiz? Emma, did you finish your art project? Mason, did you eat your apple? The conversations rarely lasted longer than 5 minutes. They became the happiest part of her day. Then life began changing so slowly that it almost looked harmless. The hospital announced a merger with a larger medical network. Employees received emails filled with optimistic phrases: operational restructuring, efficiency improvements, strategic consolidation. Sandra didn't fully understand the language. Neither did most people. She only noticed that familiar faces slowly disappeared. Departments combined. Schedules changed. Supervisors stopped making promises. One Friday afternoon, everyone in sterile processing received invitations to separate meetings. Sandra entered the conference room carrying a clipboard. She left carrying a cardboard box. Inside it were 2 framed photographs, a ceramic coffee mug painted by Emma, one thank you card signed by a surgeon years earlier, her employee badge, nothing else. The human resources manager apologized repeatedly. It isn't about performance. Sandra nodded politely. She believed him. That somehow made everything worse. Excellent employees could still lose everything. Outside the hospital, she sat inside her car for nearly 40 minutes before starting the engine. She couldn't bring herself to drive home. How would she explain this? The children deserved certainty. She had only questions. Finding another job sounded simple until she actually tried. Applications filled entire afternoons. Interviews became shorter every week. Some hospitals wanted recent certifications she couldn't afford to renew. Others had hiring freezes. Others quietly preferred younger applicants willing to accept lower wages. Sandra accepted temporary work wherever she could, stocking shelves overnight, cleaning offices, delivering groceries. Every paycheck disappeared before reaching her checking account. Rent, electricity, gas, school supplies, medicine for Mason's asthma. The numbers never stopped chasing her. She canceled streaming services, stopped buying coffee, sold jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother. The television disappeared next, then the microwave, then extra furniture. The children noticed. Children always noticed. "Are we having another garage sale?" Emma asked one Saturday. Sandra smiled. "Just making more space." Emma accepted the answer. Caleb didn't. He watched his mother's face more carefully than any child should. One evening after dinner, he quietly placed $27.40 onto the kitchen table. Sandra stared at the small pile of crumpled bills. Where did this come from? "I mowed lawns." "You were supposed to spend that on yourself." "I wanted us to have groceries." Sandra immediately pushed the money back toward him. "No." "But Mom." "No." Her voice remained calm. "So listen carefully." She knelt until their eyes met. "You are 12 years old. You are allowed to help around the house. You are allowed to learn responsibility. But you are never responsible for keeping this family alive." Tears gathered in Caleb's eyes. Sandra hugged him before either of them cried. The eviction notice arrived 11 days later. It was folded neatly inside a white envelope taped to the apartment door. 36 days overdue. Sandra had already spoken with the landlord twice. He wasn't cruel. He simply couldn't afford tenants who couldn't pay. She thanked him for giving her extra time. He apologized for not being able to give more. Neither one blamed the other. That somehow hurt even more. Sandra spent the next month searching for apartments. Every application required income she no longer had. Security deposits larger than her savings. Credit scores damaged by overdue bills. Waiting lists stretched for months. One landlord glanced at her paperwork and quietly said, "I'm sorry." He truly sounded sorry. Still, the answer remained no. On the final afternoon before they had to leave, Sandra packed everything that mattered into plastic storage bins. Clothes, school books, family photographs, medical records, Emma's drawings, Caleb's cookie tin filled with lunch notes, Mason's blue dinosaur. The rest stayed behind. Furniture could be replaced. Memories couldn't. The children believed they were going on a short adventure. Sandra never used the word homeless. Instead, she smiled gently. "We're going to camp together for a little while." Emma's eyes brightened. "Like camping?" "Something like that." Mason clapped excitedly. Only Caleb looked toward the apartment one last time. He understood enough to remain silent. Sandra loaded the final storage bin into their aging blue Ford Explorer. She closed the rear hatch carefully. Not because it was heavy, because once it shut, there would be no home waiting behind them. She climbed into the driver's seat. The children waved goodbye to the apartment building as though they would return next week. Sandra smiled until they turned the corner. Only then did the tears finally come. She wiped them away before anyone in the back seat could notice. She made herself one silent promise. "My children may have to sleep inside this vehicle, but they will never believe that hope has left this family." She started the engine. Without realizing it, the longest journey of their lives had already begun. The first night inside the Ford Explorer felt strangely quiet. Not because the city had gone silent. Columbus never truly slept. Somewhere in the distance, freight trains rumbled across old tracks. Delivery trucks backed into loading docks with sharp electronic beeps. Ambulances occasionally cut through the darkness with flashing lights and sirens that faded as quickly as they came. The silence came from the back seat. No one asked when they were going home. Sandra suspected the children understood more than they admitted. She parked beneath a street lamp outside a 24-hour grocery store. Not too close to the entrance, not too far away. She had already learned that the security guards noticed cars that never moved. She folded the second and third rows flat, spreading old blankets over the uneven surface. The children squeezed together naturally. Caleb insisted Emma sleep in the middle because it was warmer. Mason curled against his brother's shoulder with his worn blue dinosaur tucked beneath one arm. Sandra sat in the driver's seat for a long time after they closed their eyes. She adjusted the rearview mirror, watching their faces instead of the empty parking lot. They looked peaceful. Children had a remarkable ability to borrow tomorrow's worries from no one. Adults were rarely that fortunate. She whispered the same sentence her own mother used to tell her whenever life became uncertain. "We're together." Nothing more, nothing less. The next morning began before sunrise. At 5:15 a.m., Sandra quietly slipped out of the SUV carrying a small toiletry bag and a gallon jug of water. A nearby church opened its fellowship hall every weekday at 6. Pastor William had never asked questions. He simply unlocked the side entrance early enough for people who needed a clean restroom before work. Sandra washed her face, brushed everyone's teeth one at a time, helped Emma braid her hair, used a damp washcloth to clean Mason's cheeks. She ironed nothing. Yet somehow every shirt looked neatly tucked. Every collar sat correctly. Every shoelace stayed tied. Appearance became another form of protection. People often judged what they believed they saw. If the children looked cared for, perhaps no one would wonder where they slept. Breakfast usually came from careful planning: peanut butter sandwiches, bananas, oatmeal prepared with hot water from the church kitchen, milk purchased in the smallest cartons because they had no refrigerator. Sandra counted every dollar before entering a grocery store. Not approximately, exactly. $6.82 meant $6.82. No impulse purchases, no forgotten snacks, no room for mistakes. Caleb quietly inherited the habit. He carried a small spiral notebook everywhere. Every evening, he recorded expenses. Gas, laundry, medicine, food. He never complained. He simply wrote. One afternoon, Sandra noticed him erasing something. What was that? He hesitated. I wrote home. She frowned gently. What do you mean? I was trying to figure out how much home costs. Sandra couldn't answer. Instead, she reached across the front seats and squeezed his hand. I promise you something. What? One day, you'll write home again. But it won't be in that notebook. He nodded without speaking. Every school morning followed the same careful choreography. Sandra drove to the public library parking lot 15 minutes before classes began. The library had clean restrooms, free Wi-Fi, air conditioning during the summer, heat during the winter. It became their unofficial living room. The librarians noticed the family almost immediately. Mrs. Denise Harper, the children's librarian, greeted Emma by name after only a week. You found another mystery book. Emma smiled shyly. They're my favorite. Mrs. Harper always stamped the books without asking unnecessary questions. Sometimes kindness looked exactly like respecting another person's privacy. Sandra appreciated that more than anyone realized. While the children attended school, Sandra searched endlessly for work. She updated resumes, renewed expired certifications online whenever she found free courses, applied to clinics, surgical centers, dental offices, medical supply companies. She attended job fairs carrying a navy blue folder that slowly became softer at the edges from constant handling. Inside were recommendation letters from surgeons, performance evaluations, certificates, evidence that she had once belonged somewhere. Most employers smiled politely. Many promised to call. Very few did. By afternoon, she picked up the children exactly on time. Routine mattered. Consistency mattered. Children deserved at least one thing they could predict. Every Tuesday, they visited the laundromat. Sandra loved Tuesdays. Not because washing clothes was enjoyable, because clean clothes gave everyone a little more dignity. She taught the children to separate whites from colors. Emma liked pouring detergent into the machine. Mason enjoyed watching clothes tumble through the glass. Caleb folded shirts with surprising precision. The owner of the laundromat, Mr. Leonard Price, often pretended one dryer had malfunctioned. Use that one instead, he'd say. It was always the machine that didn't require payment. Sandra knew exactly what he was doing. She also knew pretending not to notice protected both of their pride. So, she always thanked him for fixing the machine. One evening, Emma found colorful origami paper inside the library's children's craft room. Mrs. Harper smiled. We're replacing supplies next week. You can have these leftovers. Emma's eyes sparkled. There are so many colors. That night, parked beneath another streetlight, Emma carefully folded her first paper star. It wasn't perfect. One corner bent the wrong way. Another point looked uneven. She held it proudly anyway. It's beautiful, Sandra whispered. Emma crawled forward between the seats. Can we hang it? Where? Emma pointed toward the SUV's ceiling. Sandra searched through a storage bin until she found transparent tape. Together, they attached the tiny yellow star above the back seat. It swung gently whenever someone closed a door. Why there? Caleb asked. Emma thought for a moment. So, when we wake up, we'll see something pretty first. Sandra smiled. I like that. The following evening, Emma folded another, then another. Soon, every night ended the same way. Dinner, homework, stories. One paper star. She developed a small ritual. After finishing each star, she whispered softly, Every tomorrow deserves another star. At first, Mason repeated the sentence because it sounded nice. Later, Caleb quietly joined them. Eventually, Sandra found herself saying it too. None of them talked about why. They didn't need to. The words meant something different to each person. To Emma, they meant hope. To Mason, they meant bedtime. To Caleb, they meant another day survived. To Sandra, they became a promise she desperately wanted to keep. As weeks passed, the SUV slowly transformed. Plastic storage bins fit together like furniture. Blankets folded into neat stacks every morning. School backpacks hung from hooks attached with adhesive strips. A small flashlight remained beside Sandra's seat. The paper stars multiplied. 5, 12, 23, 31. Whenever sunlight entered through the windshield, tiny reflections danced across the ceiling. Even inside an old vehicle, the children had somehow created their own sky. Sandra refused to let disorder take over. Every evening before bed, she repeated the same checklist. Shoes lined together, trash removed, homework packed, an inhaler beside Mason's blanket, gas tank above half if possible, phones charged at the library, tomorrow's clothes folded. Routine protected hope. Hope protected children. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Emma climbed into the SUV carrying a drawing from school. It showed a small blue car beneath dozens of bright yellow stars. 4 smiling stick figures stood beside it. Above them, she had written in large, uneven letters, "Home is where Mom hugs us." Sandra looked at the picture for several seconds before speaking. "Did your teacher ask everyone to draw their house?" Emma nodded. "Were you embarrassed?" Emma looked confused. "No," she shrugged. "Our car is where we live." Then she smiled. "But it's only temporary." Sandra swallowed hard. "How do you know that?" Emma pointed toward the Sungsa, the growing constellation above their heads. "Because every tomorrow deserves another star." Sandra turned toward the driver's window before the tears reached her eyes. Children believed promises without demanding proof. That faith terrified her. Because every new sunrise made one question heavier than the day before. How much longer could she protect that belief before reality caught up with all of them? By the middle of October, Sandra could predict Mason's asthma before he said a single word. It always began with silence. Most children complained when they felt sick. Mason became unusually quiet. He would stop humming to his blue dinosaur. He would climb into the back seat without asking questions. His small shoulders tightened with every breath until Sandra noticed the faint whistle that escaped his chest. That sound terrified her more than any overdue bill. On Tuesday afternoon, the first cold front of the season swept through Columbus. The air turned sharp. Dry leaves skittered across the library parking lot. Sandra watched Mason rub his chest as they loaded their backpacks into the SUV. "You okay, buddy?" He nodded automatically. "I'm fine." The answer came too quickly. Caleb looked at his little brother, then at their mother. He coughed during reading class. Sandra's eyes met Caleb's in the rearview mirror. "How much?" "A lot." Mason tried to smile. "It doesn't hurt." Sandra knew he was protecting her. Children who watched adults struggle often learn to hide their own pain. She started the engine without another word. 25 minutes later, they were walking through the automatic doors of Riverside Regional Medical Center. The emergency department looked exactly as it always did. Televisions whispered above rows of plastic chairs. Phones rang behind the registration desk. Parents rocked crying babies. A construction worker held an ice pack against his forehead. A teenager limped beside his football coach. Life and fear mixed together beneath bright fluorescent lights. Sandra filled out the intake paperwork with practiced efficiency. Insurance information, emergency contacts, medical history she wrote carefully, refusing to rush despite the pressure around her. The receptionist glanced at the address line. Sandra hesitated for barely half a second before writing the mailing address of a church outreach office that had agreed to receive important mail for several families. It wasn't a lie. It simply wasn't where they slept. Within minutes, a nurse called Mason's name. His oxygen level had dropped slightly. Not dangerously, just enough to require a breathing treatment. Sandra sat beside him while the nebulizer mask covered his small face. Emma quietly colored pictures at the corner of the room. Caleb read a science textbook but looked up every few seconds. Sandra noticed everything. She always did. The nearly empty inhaler in her purse. The crack in one sneaker Caleb kept trying to hide. The fact that Emma's jacket sleeves had become an inch too short. Children grew even when life stood still. About 40 minutes later, Dr. Michael Carter stepped into the examination room. He wore dark blue scrubs beneath a white coat with sleeves rolled halfway to his elbows. His silver hair had begun to thin and faint lines framed the corners of his eyes. He looked like a man who had listened to thousands of difficult stories without forgetting how to listen. "Good evening, Mason." The little boy lifted the nebulizer mask. "Hi, Dr. Carter." Michael smiled. "I heard you've been making dinosaurs nervous with all that coughing." Mason giggled. "My dinosaur isn't scared. No, he protects me." Michael nodded seriously. "Then I suppose we're both on the same team." He examined Mason carefully. Listened to his lungs, checked his breathing, adjusted the treatment plan. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. The medication worked as expected. Still, Michael found himself studying Sandra while he reviewed the chart. She never interrupted, never exaggerated symptoms, never demanded special attention. She answered every question with remarkable precision. When did the coughing begin? Around 1:15 this afternoon. Any fever? No. Any recent allergies? Leaves started falling this week. That usually makes him worse. Michael looked at the medical record. 3 emergency visits over the past 6 weeks. Always for asthma. Always during evenings. Always with the same quiet mother. He noticed another detail. Every balance left after insurance assistance, $23, $38, $18, had eventually been paid. Not immediately, but always. Someone making very little money kept returning to settle every small debt. That stayed with him. Most people assumed poverty and irresponsibility belonged together. His experience had taught him otherwise. As he prepared to leave, Mason reached toward his stuffed dinosaur. Its stitched tail had begun to tear away. Michael smiled. "Looks like he needs surgery, too." Sandra laughed softly for the first time that evening. "I've been promising to fix him." "You sew?" "A little." "My mother used to fix everything." Michael said it almost absent-mindedly. "Clothes, backpacks, stuffed animals." He paused. "I thought she had magic hands." Sandra smiled. "I think every child believes that about their mother." Michael nodded. "I suppose we do." For reasons he couldn't explain, that simple exchange lingered after he left the room. Hours later, while completing paperwork, he found himself glancing at Mason's chart again. Not because anything was medically unusual, because something felt unfinished. The family returned twice more over the following month. Each visit followed the same pattern. Mason's asthma flared. Sandra arrived calm. The children stayed remarkably well behaved. No raised voices, no panic, no demands. One evening, while another physician handled the treatment, Michael walked past their room and saw Caleb helping Emma with multiplication homework. The emergency room buzzed with activity around them. Inside that tiny examination room, it almost looked like a kitchen table at home. Sandra sat beside Mason reading a picture book while waiting for discharge papers. She wasn't scrolling through her phone. She wasn't complaining about the delay. She simply used every spare minute to be present with her children. Michael stood outside for a moment longer than necessary. "Nurse," a voice behind him interrupted his thoughts. He stepped aside, embarrassed to realize he'd been staring. Later that week, Michael met with respiratory therapist Angela Foster during a shift change. "You've noticed the Anderson family." Angela immediately knew who he meant. "The little boy with asthma." "Yes. They're wonderful. You know them. They're here often enough." Angela lowered her voice. "The kids always say thank you." Michael smiled faintly. "That's unusual." "You'd be surprised." She organized a stack of charts before continuing. "The mother worries about everyone except herself." "What do you mean?" "Last visit, she asked whether another child waiting outside should be seen first because he looked sicker." Michael looked toward the hallway. "Really?" Angela nodded. "I've never heard her ask for anything." That sentence stayed with him for the rest of the day. "I've never heard her ask for anything." The following Friday brought freezing rain. Patients crowded the emergency department. Michael's shift stretched 2 hours beyond schedule. By the time he finally removed his stethoscope, exhaustion settled deep into his shoulders. He walked toward the employee exit carrying a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, rain coated every windshield in silver. Most employees hurried toward their cars without looking around. Michael almost did the same. Then he noticed Sandra walking across the parking lot. She held Mason against one shoulder despite the boy insisting he could walk. Caleb carried 2 backpacks. Emma carefully protected a paper grocery bag beneath her jacket. Sandra stopped beside an older blue Ford Explorer parked beneath a flickering lamp. Michael assumed she was loading the children before driving home. Instead, he watched something he couldn't quite understand. Caleb unfolded blankets from the cargo area. Emma reached up toward the ceiling inside the vehicle. Sandra carefully arranged pillows across the back seat before helping Mason climb inside. The movement looked practiced, almost routine. Michael slowed his pace. The rain blurred the windshield. The interior remained difficult to see. He stood for only a moment before reminding himself that families organized cars in all kinds of ways. Still, something about the scene settled heavily in his chest. He couldn't explain why. He simply knew that for the first time he wasn't thinking about Mason's asthma. He was thinking about where this family was going after they drove away. And a quiet voice inside him whispered a question he couldn't ignore. What if they weren't driving home at all? Dr. Michael Carter remained beneath the hospital awning long after the rain had soaked the edge of his shoes. The blue Ford Explorer never left the parking lot. Most cars pulled out within minutes of discharge. Families drove home, employees headed toward quiet neighborhoods. Night shift nurses arrived carrying oversized coffee mugs. The Explorer stayed exactly where it was. Michael checked his watch, 9:43 p.m. He told himself he was imagining things. Perhaps Sandra was waiting for traffic to ease. Perhaps one of the children had fallen asleep. Perhaps she simply needed a moment before driving. He climbed into his own sedan and started the engine. Then he turned it off again. The windshield wipers swept away another sheet of rain. The Explorer remained motionless. At 10:06, a security officer slowly drove through the lot. Michael watched him pause near Sandra's vehicle. The officer rolled down his window. Sandra stepped outside with a polite smile. Even from a distance, Michael could see the conversation was calm. She pointed toward the emergency entrance, then toward Mason's inhaler bag. The officer nodded. He tipped his cap before driving away. No argument, no warning, just quiet understanding. Michael found himself wondering how often that conversation had happened. He finally drove home. But the image of that blue SUV followed him all the way across the city, Sleep came in fragments that night. At 3:18 a.m., Michael gave up trying. He walked into the kitchen of his small townhouse and poured himself coffee. The house was silent. Photographs lined one wall. Medical school graduation. His late wife, Claire, laughing beside Lake Erie years earlier. Their son, Nathan, on his first day of college. Another frame held a faded black and white photograph of a young woman standing beside an old station wagon. His mother? People who visited often assumed it had simply been an old family car. Only Michael knew it had once been their home. He picked up the photograph. His mother couldn't have been older than Sandra was now. She smiled in the picture despite owning almost nothing. Michael remembered sleeping beneath blankets that smelled faintly of gasoline. He remembered pretending camping was exciting. He remembered his mother brushing his hair every morning inside a church restroom before school. He remembered believing that every family washed their faces in public sinks. Children accepted whatever adults called normal. Only years later did they understand. He carefully placed the photograph back on the shelf. Some memories never really disappeared. They simply waited. The following afternoon brought another busy emergency shift. A construction accident filled 3 trauma rooms. An elderly woman arrived with pneumonia. A teenager suffered a broken wrist after falling from a skateboard. By evening, Michael had almost convinced himself he had overreacted. Then, just after 7, he saw Sandra again. This time, she wasn't a patient. She sat quietly in the pediatric waiting area while Mason colored dinosaurs beside her. Emma read a library book. Caleb worked through algebra homework. Sandra wasn't waiting to be seen. She was using the hospital's free Wi-Fi to submit job applications. Michael noticed because her laptop displayed the words, "Application successfully submitted." Another one, then another. She closed each rejection email without changing her expression. No frustration. No anger. Just another application. Another attempt. A volunteer approached with sandwiches donated by a local bakery. "Ma'am, would your children like something to eat?" Sandra hesitated. "Only if there are enough for everyone else." The volunteer smiled warmly. "We have plenty." Sandra thanked her. Before opening the paper bags, she divided everything equally. Half a sandwich for Caleb, half for Emma, half for Mason. The smallest piece remained for herself. Michael noticed she quietly pushed part of her own meal onto Mason's napkin when the boy wasn't looking. She pretended she wasn't hungry. He had seen that before. His own mother had performed the exact same trick. "I'm full." Adults lied like that only for children. Near the end of his shift, Angela Foster walked beside Michael towards the staff elevators. "You look distracted." "I am." "Bad day." He shook his head. "No." After several seconds, he finally asked, "Do you know much about Sandra Anderson?" Angela thought for a moment. "Only little things." "Like what?" "She always thanks housekeeping." Michael smiled faintly. "That's oddly specific. I notice people who notice invisible workers." Angela continued. "She remembers names. She asked about my father's surgery after meeting him only once." She shrugged. Some people carry kindness naturally. Michael looked toward the waiting room where Sandra now packed away the children's school supplies. "Has she ever mentioned family?" "No." "Friends?" Angela shook her head. "I don't think she has many." That answer felt heavier than expected. 2 nights later, Michael volunteered to stay late after another physician became ill. His shift ended shortly before 2 in the morning. The hospital parking lot had emptied again. Only scattered employee vehicles remained beneath the tall lights. As he walked toward his car, movement inside the Blue Explorer caught his eye. It was parked beneath the same flickering lamp, exactly where it had been before. This time, curiosity gave way to concern. He didn't approach immediately. Instead, he stood several rows away. The rear hatch opened. Caleb climbed out carrying a gallon water jug. Sandra unfolded another blanket. Emma carefully taped something to the ceiling. Michael narrowed his eyes. Colorful paper, yellow, blue, pink, stars. Dozens of them. Some hung from clear thread. Others were taped carefully above each sleeping space. When the doors opened, they swayed gently, like tiny constellations. Emma smiled proudly. I found room for one more. Sandra looked upward. I think it's beautiful. Mason yawned. Can we make another tomorrow? Emma nodded enthusiastically. Every tomorrow deserves another star. The little boy repeated the sentence sleepily. Every tomorrow. Michael felt something tighten inside his chest. He had heard children invent games before, but this wasn't just a game. It was a ritual, a promise. Hope made visible. Sandra tucked blankets around all three children with extraordinary care. She checked Mason's inhaler, adjusted Caleb's jacket beneath his head, pulled one loose strand of hair away from Emma's face. Only after every child looked comfortable did she sit in the driver's seat. She removed a small sewing kit. The flashlight resting on the dashboard illuminated a torn backpack. Caleb's. She threaded a needle with practiced hands. One careful stitch after another. Repairing instead of replacing. Saving instead of spending. Preserving instead of surrendering. Michael suddenly remembered the conversation about stuffed dinosaurs. My mother used to fix everything. Sandra had smiled knowingly. Now he understood why. She fixed things because buying new ones wasn't an option. Rain began again. Soft at first, then heavier. The Explorer's windows slowly fogged from the warmth inside. The paper stars glowed faintly beneath a tiny battery lantern. It looked less like a vehicle than a fragile little world balanced against the darkness. Michael realized he had stopped breathing normally. He knew, not suspected, not wondered. Knew. This family wasn't resting before driving home. They were already home. He reached instinctively toward his phone. His thumb hovered over emergency services. No. Calling the police would frighten the children. Calling Child Protective Services without understanding the full situation could tear the family apart before anyone asked why they were there. Sandra wasn't neglecting her children. She was protecting them with every resource she had left. Michael scrolled instead to a number he hadn't called in almost 3 years. He stared at the familiar name. Eleanor Brooks, Executive Director, Central Ohio Medical Workforce Initiative. The woman who had once changed his own mother's life with a single conversation. He pressed call. The phone rang twice. Eleanor speaking. Michael looked once more towards the glowing paper stars inside the Explorer. His voice came out quieter than he expected. Eleanor. He paused, swallowing the emotion rising unexpectedly into his throat. I think I just found someone who's trying desperately not to let her children stop dreaming. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. Yet, when Dr. Michael Carter slipped his phone back into his pocket, he felt as though he had reached across nearly 3 decades. He remained standing beneath the drizzle while the blue Ford Explorer sat quietly beneath the parking lot light. Inside, Sandra continued sewing. She had no idea that a single phone call had just altered the direction of her life. Michael had almost forgotten how Eleanor Brooks answered difficult conversations. She never interrupted. She never rushed people. She listened until silence arrived on its own. Only then had she asked one question. Is she asking for help? Michael looked through the rain-speckled windshield toward Sandra. No. Eleanor sighed softly. They rarely do. Another pause. Does she still have her dignity? Michael answered immediately. Completely. Good. Eleanor's voice became firmer. Then we start there. The following morning, Eleanor Brooks arrived at her office before sunrise. At 61, she had learned that the quietest hour of the day often produced the clearest decisions. Her office overlooked a renovated brick warehouse that now housed classroom simulation labs and career counseling offices. On the wall hung dozens of framed photographs, graduation ceremonies, former students wearing hospital badges, families smiling beside apartment keys, children hugging parents in medical uniforms. None of the pictures showed donations. They showed employment. That distinction mattered deeply to Eleanor. Her organization had never existed simply to hand out emergency assistance. It existed to help people rebuild careers. Because careers outlasted charity, she unlocked a gray filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled Medical Workforce Reentry Initiative. The program had been created after several rural hospitals closed across Ohio. Hundreds of experienced healthcare workers had suddenly found themselves unemployed. Some recovered quickly. Others disappeared beneath housing problems, debt illness, or family crises. Eleanor believed talent should never be wasted simply because life became difficult. She opened a fresh notebook. Across the top of the first page, she wrote one name, Sandra Anderson. Nothing else, no assumptions, no conclusions, only a name. Sandra knew nothing about any of this. Her morning began exactly as the previous one had. She woke before the children, folded blankets, wiped condensation from the inside of the windows, checked Mason's breathing before checking the fuel gauge. Half a tank. Enough for another day if she planned carefully. She smiled at the children as though sleeping inside a vehicle required no explanation. Who's ready for breakfast? Emma raised both hands dramatically. I vote for oatmeal. I second that, Caleb replied. Mason hugged his dinosaur. I vote pancakes. Sandra laughed. I'll remember that vote. They drove toward the church. Pastor William greeted them with his usual warm smile. Morning, friends. Morning. He never asked where they had spent the night. Sandra appreciated him more for that than he probably realized. Compassion did not always require questions. Sometimes it required restraint. After breakfast, the children left for school. Sandra parked outside the public library and opened her laptop. Her email inbox contained 6 new messages, 5 polite rejections, 1 notification that another application remained under review. She breathed out slowly. 5 seconds of disappointment. Then she opened another employment website. The work itself mattered, not the rejection. She refused to let no become her routine. Around 11 o'clock, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Collection agencies often used unfamiliar numbers. Instead, she answered, Hello. Good morning. May I speak with Sandra Anderson? This is Sandra. My name is Angela Ruiz. I work with the Central Ohio Medical Workforce Initiative. Sandra frowned. I'm sorry. We help healthcare professionals return to clinical careers after layoffs or extended employment gaps. Sandra remained cautious. I never contacted your organization. No, Angela answered gently. You didn't. A brief silence followed. We recently became aware of your previous experience in sterile processing. Sandra's fingers tightened around the phone. My certifications have expired. We know. I'm not sure I can afford renewal. Our program covers that. Sandra looked through the library window toward the parking lot. Experience had taught her to distrust opportunities that sounded too easy. There must be a catch. There isn't. Nothing is free. Angela smiled, though Sandra couldn't see it. This isn't free. It requires hard work, classroom instruction, clinical evaluations, examinations. If you complete everything successfully, hospitals agree to interview graduates. Sandra said nothing. She had imagined many phone calls over the past year. None sounded like this. Finally, she asked quietly, "Why me?" Angela glanced toward Eleanor's office before answering. "Because someone believes your experience shouldn't be wasted." Sandra's heartbeat quickened. "Who?" "I'm afraid that isn't my story to tell." All afternoon the conversation replayed inside Sandra's mind. Opportunity, training, certification, interview. The words felt almost dangerous. Hope had become something she handled carefully. Too much hope could hurt worse than disappointment. When she collected the children after school, Emma immediately noticed something different. "You look happy." Sandra smiled faintly. "I look confused." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "That's different," she laughed. "I got a phone call." "What kind?" "I'm not sure yet." That evening, they ate vegetable soup served by volunteers at a neighborhood church. Sandra barely tasted it. Her thoughts remained elsewhere. After dinner, while Emma folded another paper star, Caleb spoke quietly. "Mom." "If it's a job," she looked up, "you should take it." Sandra hesitated. "We don't even know what it is." "You smiled today." He looked down at his bowl. "I haven't seen that smile for a while." Sandra reached across the table and squeezed his shoulder. "I'll find out more." The next morning, Sandra drove to the address Angela had given her. The building surprised her. It wasn't glamorous. No marble floors, no expensive artwork, just clean classrooms filled with medical equipment. People wearing scrubs practiced assembling surgical trays behind large glass windows. The familiar metallic sound instantly transported Sandra back to the department she had once loved. For the first time in over a year, she smelled sterilization wrap and disinfectant. She hadn't realized how much she missed it. Angela greeted her warmly. "I'm glad you came." "I almost didn't." "I know." They walked through the training center together. Every hallway displayed photographs of former graduates now working in hospitals across Ohio. Some had once been nurses, others medical assistants, respiratory therapists, laboratory technicians, people who had lost careers and found them again. Angela stopped outside a conference room. "Before we begin, I want to introduce some physician." Inside stood Eleanor Brooks. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and she wore no jewelry except a simple wedding band. She crossed the room with calm confidence and extended her hand. "Sandra Anderson." Sandra shook it. "It's nice to meet you." Eleanor looked directly into her eyes. "No," she smiled warmly. "It's an honor." Sandra blinked. "I'm not sure why." "You've protected your children through circumstances most people couldn't imagine." Sandra stiffened. A wave of alarm passed through her face. "How do you know about my children?" Eleanor noticed the fear immediately. She lowered her voice. "Because someone saw your strength." Sandra took one cautious step backward. "I don't want pity." Eleanor nodded. "Good. Neither do I." She let those words settle before continuing. "I didn't invite you here because you're living through hardship. I invited you because you're an experienced sterile processing technician. And because I believe you still have something hospitals desperately need." Sandra stared at her for several long seconds. No one had spoken to her that way since losing her job. Not as someone broken, as someone valuable. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps the hardest chapter of her life was not the final one. Sandra sat motionless even after Eleanor Brooks finished speaking. Valuable. The word echoed through her mind with almost painful force. It had been over a year since anyone had described her that way. Since losing her job, most conversations had revolved around what she lacked. Lacked income, lacked housing, lacked recent certifications, lacked references with current employers. No one talked about what she still possessed. Her discipline, her experience, her steady hands, her integrity. Eleanor seemed to notice the storm of emotions crossing Sandra's face. "You don't have to answer today," Sandra finally found her voice. "If I say yes, you'll work harder than you've worked in years. And if I fail, you'll know you failed while moving forward." Eleanor smiled gently. "That's different from standing still." Sandra looked through the conference room window towards the training lab. A young man in blue scrubs carefully assembled a surgical tray under an instructor's supervision. The movement felt familiar, almost comforting. For just a second, she could picture herself doing the same work again. Then reality returned. "My children?" Eleanor nodded. "I expected that question. I'm alone. I have 3 kids. I don't have anyone to watch them. And," Sandra hesitated before continuing, "I don't even have a place to study." The room became quiet. Angela Ruiz slid a folder across the table. "We've already thought about those problems." Sandra frowned. "What do you mean?" "The evening cohort meets after school hours. We partner with the community childcare program. The public library reserves study rooms for participants. There are transportation vouchers if you need them." Sandra looked from one woman to the other. "You planned all this." Eleanor shook her head. "No, we built the program because every student arrives carrying different burdens. You won't receive special treatment. You'll receive a fair opportunity." There was a difference. Sandra understood it immediately. She closed the folder without opening it. "I need one day. Take 2 if you need them." "No," Sandra answered softly. "If I wait too long." I'll find reasons not to believe this." Eleanor smiled. "I've heard that before." Driving away from the center felt strangely different. The Ford Explorer still rattled over rough pavement. The fuel gauge still hovered just above 1/4 of a tank. The check engine light still glowed. Nothing had changed. Yet everything felt slightly lighter. Hope had weight. So did possibility. When Sandra reached the elementary school, Emma ran toward the SUV, holding a construction paper pumpkin. "Mom!" "I got picked for the fall art display." Sandra hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you." Caleb climbed into the passenger seat. He studied his mother's expression. "You decided." "I haven't." "You almost have." Sandra laughed. "How do you always know?" "You drum your fingers on the steering wheel when you're thinking." She looked down. He was right. She hadn't noticed. That evening, the Explorer refused to start. Sandra turned the key once. A weak clicking sound answered. She tried again. Nothing. The children waited quietly. No one spoke. Sandra rested both hands on the steering wheel. "Not now. Please. Not now." She tried a third time. Silence. Caleb quietly climbed out. "I'll push." Sandra immediately shook her head. "No." "What else are we going to do?" Before she could answer, an older man loading groceries into the next parking space looked over. "You need a jump." Sandra hesitated. "We're okay." The man smiled kindly. "Ma'am, I wasn't asking because I think you're helpless. I was asking because I have jumper cables." Something about his tone eased her embarrassment. 10 minutes later, the engine finally started. Sandra reached for her wallet. "I'd like to pay you." The man looked almost offended. "For what?" "Helping us." He closed the hood gently. "My wife says accepting kindness is sometimes how you let other people become better." He waved as he walked away. "Take care of those kids." Sandra watched him disappear into the supermarket. Emma leaned forward. "Nice people still exist." Sandra smiled. "Yes, they do." The following morning brought another problem. The mechanic confirmed what Sandra already feared. The batteries failing. The alternator's getting weak, too. How much? He typed numbers into a computer. Sandra felt her stomach tighten. $587. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the number felt impossible. She had less than $80 available after paying for food and Mason's medication. I understand. She thanked the mechanic and drove away before tears reached her eyes. The SUV still ran. For now. She simply couldn't afford for it to stop. It wasn't just transportation anymore, it was their shelter. That afternoon, Caleb quietly unfolded his small expense notebook. He stared at a blank page before writing carefully. Battery, $587. Sandra noticed. You don't have to write everything. I know. Then why do it? He shrugged. So, one day we'll remember how far we came. She looked at him for several seconds. Some children collected baseball cards. Her son collected evidence that tomorrow could become better than today. That night, temperatures dropped below freezing for the first time. Sandra parked near the hospital again because the area remained well lit and relatively safe. She layered blankets carefully around the children. Emma reached into her backpack. I almost forgot. She unfolded a square of deep blue paper. What colors start tonight? Sandra smiled. Blue. Emma worked slowly. Each fold looked more confident than the last. Mason watched sleepily. When we have a house, he yawned. Can we still make stars? Sandra answered without hesitation. Every single night if you want. Emma finished the star. She looked toward the ceiling. There isn't much room left. Indeed, the inside of the Explorer had changed. More than 60 paper stars now covered the ceiling. They shimmered whenever headlights passed. Each one represented another day the family had stayed together. Another day they hadn't given up. Emma carefully taped the blue star beside a yellow one. Then, as always, she whispered, "Every tomorrow deserves another star." Caleb repeated the sentence. Then Mason. Finally Sandra. The ritual settled around them like a blanket. Long after the children fell asleep, Sandra opened the folder Eleanor had given her. Inside were course schedules, certification requirements, clinical placement information, a blank enrollment form. At the very back sat a handwritten note, not printed, not typed, written in blue ink. Sandra, opportunity cannot erase yesterday, but it can give tomorrow somewhere new to begin. Whatever you decide, remember this. You are applying because we need skilled people like you, not because we feel sorry for you. Eleanor Brooks. Sandra read the note 3 times. Then she reached for a pen. Her hand hovered above the signature line. She wanted to sign. She wanted to believe. But fear had become a habit almost as strong as hope. She closed the folder. I'll decide tomorrow, she whispered. Above her, dozens of paper stars swayed gently with the cold autumn wind rocking the old SUV. And somewhere across the city, Eleanor Brooks received a brief text message from Dr. Michael Carter. Only 6 words appeared on her screen. She came today. She's almost ready. Eleanor smiled before turning off her bedside lamp. Sometimes the hardest step wasn't opening a door. It was believing you deserved to walk through it. Sandra signed the enrollment form at 6:42 the next morning. She did it sitting in the driver's seat while the children were still asleep. For nearly 10 minutes, the pen rested between her fingers without moving. The signature itself took less than 3 seconds. When it was finished, she stared at her own name. Sandra Anderson. The letters looked ordinary, yet they represented the bravest decision she had made since losing her home. She folded the form carefully and slipped it back into Eleanor's folder before waking the children. Good morning, sleepyheads. Emma stretched beneath her blanket. Did you make another star? Sandra smiled. Not yet. Why? Because today we're going to make something even more important. What? I'll tell you after school. The morning routine unfolded as usual. Church restroom, oatmeal, school drop-off. Nothing about the outside of their lives suggested anything had changed. Inside Sandra, however, a quiet shift had begun. Instead of driving directly to the library, she headed toward the Central Ohio Medical Workforce Initiative. Angela Ruiz greeted her with the same warm smile. "I was hoping we'd see you." Sandra handed over the signed enrollment form. "I don't know if I'm ready." Angela glanced at the signature before looking back at Sandra. Nobody ever is. She accepted the paperwork without ceremony. No applause, no dramatic congratulations, just a simple handshake. Welcome. For the first time in months, Sandra belonged somewhere again. Orientation took place that afternoon. There were 12 students. A former surgical assistant whose clinic had closed. A laboratory technician returning after caring for her husband with cancer. A military medic transitioning to civilian health care. A pharmacy technician rebuilding life after addiction recovery. No one introduced themselves by their failures. Instead, each person shared why they wanted another chance. When Sandra's turn came, she hesitated. "My name is Sandra Anderson." She paused. "I used to work in sterile processing." Another pause. "I loved my job." Silence filled the room. Then she added quietly, "I'd like to love it again." Nobody clapped. Nobody pitied her. Several people simply nodded. That felt even better. Kevin Turner entered a few minutes later carrying a stainless steel instrument tray. Sandra recognized him immediately. He had occasionally visited Riverside before the layoffs. Kevin stopped for a moment. "Sandra." She stood. "It's been a while." "It has." He smiled genuinely. "I remember your inspection reports." Sandra blinked. "You do? You caught mistakes other people missed." He placed the tray on the demonstration table. "I was hoping you'd come." Those words settled deep inside her. Someone remembered her work, not her hardship. Her work. The first lesson felt like riding a bicycle after years away. Some procedures returned almost instantly. Others felt frustratingly distant. Instrument classifications, sterilization indicators, packaging standards, updated infection control protocols. Healthcare had changed while Sandra struggled simply to survive. She filled page after page with notes. When class ended, most students headed home. Sandra remained behind reviewing diagrams. Kevin walked past. Long day. I forgot more than I realized. Kevin leaned against the doorway. "That's normal." "It doesn't feel normal." "It feels embarrassing." He shook his head. "No. It feels honest." He pointed toward the open textbook. "You still ask good questions. You still double-check your work. I can teach procedures. I can't teach that." Sandra looked down at her notes. For the first time since losing her job, she believed experience hadn't disappeared. It had simply become dusty. After picking up the children, Sandra told them everything while they shared macaroni donated by the church kitchen. Emma nearly dropped her fork. "You have school too," Sandra laughed. "I guess I do." Caleb grinned. "So now we all have homework." "It looks that way." Mason tilted his head. "Can I help?" Sandra kissed the top of his head. "You already do." "How?" "You remind me why I'm studying." The little boy accepted that answer proudly. Homework became a family event. Every evening, the Explorer transformed into a tiny classroom. The library closed at 8. After that, Sandra parked beneath a bright light near the hospital. Caleb solved algebra problems. Emma practiced spelling. Mason traced letters with washable crayons. Sandra reviewed sterilization protocols under the glow of a battery lantern. Whenever one child finished an assignment, another whispered. Instead of speaking loudly, nobody had asked them to. They simply understood. One evening, Emma looked around the vehicle. "Everybody's studying," Caleb smiled. "Looks like the smallest school in Ohio." Sandra laughed harder than she had in weeks. "Maybe, but I think it's the bravest." Progress came slowly. Sandra passed her first quiz with 84%. Higher than she expected, lower than she wanted. She stared at the score longer than necessary. Kevin noticed. "Problem. I used to know all of this. You still do." "I missed 8 questions." Kevin folded his arms. "Do you know what I see?" "What?" "A woman who hasn't worked in the field for over a year, who still scored higher than half the class." Sandra hadn't realized that. She looked again. The number hadn't changed. Only its meaning had. Not every day brought encouragement. 3 days later, they practiced assembling orthopedic instrument sets. Sandra's hands hesitated. The sequence no longer flowed naturally. A younger student completed the exercise several minutes faster. Sandra felt her confidence shrinking again. After class, she remained behind reorganizing the tray. Kevin quietly walked over. "May I tell you something?" She nodded. "I watched what happened." I froze. "No, you slowed down. There's a difference." He picked up a surgical clamp. Fast people impress classrooms. He carefully placed the instrument into its exact position. Careful people protect patients. Sandra exhaled slowly. "I used to be careful." Kevin smiled. "You still are. You've simply forgotten to trust yourself." That night, exhaustion finally caught up with her. The children fell asleep quickly. Sandra tried reading another chapter, but the words blurred together. She closed the textbook. "I'm tired." Caleb looked up from his notebook. "You've worked all day." "So have you," he smiled. "I only had 6th grade." "You had life," Sandra answered softly. He looked away, pretending not to hear the emotion in her voice. A few minutes later, Emma climbed forward carrying a fresh sheet of gold paper. "I almost forgot." Sandra smiled. "The star." Emma nodded. She folded carefully. Every crease looked deliberate now. Months of practice had made her hands confident. When she finished, she held it toward her mother. "This one is yours." "Mine?" Emma nodded. "You started school today." Sandra accepted the tiny golden star. Instead of taping it to the ceiling herself, she handed it back. "Will you hang it for me?" Emma climbed onto the folded blankets and pressed the star into an empty space near the front of the SUV. It swayed gently beside dozens of others. Sandra looked upward. For the first time, the stars no longer reminded her only of surviving another day. Now they also marked something else. Steps, lessons, possibilities. Tomorrows she could finally imagine. Quietly, almost like a prayer, the family repeated the words together. Every tomorrow deserves another star. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the branches above the parking lot. Inside, the old explorer surrounded by textbooks, blankets, sleeping children, and a ceiling full of handmade stars. Sandra opened her notes one more time. Tomorrow's quiz suddenly didn't feel like another obstacle. It felt like another step toward taking her family home. The first snowfall arrived 2 weeks earlier than expected. Sandra noticed it while walking the children into school. Tiny white flakes drifted through the gray morning sky, disappearing the moment they touched the sidewalk. Emma reached out her mitten. "It's snowing," Mason laughed as one landed on the nose of his blue dinosaur. Caleb looked toward the explorer instead. "Will we be okay tonight?" Sandra followed his gaze. The SUV had survived another month, but Winter was a different opponent. "We'll be okay." She smiled with more confidence than she felt. "We always figure things out." Caleb nodded. He wanted to believe her, so did she. The evening class focused on updated sterilization tracking systems. Computers had replaced much of the paperwork Sandra remembered. Every surgical tray now carried electronic documentation from cleaning to operating room. Kevin Turner walked between workstations while students practiced entering records. Sandra struggled. Not with the medical procedures, with the software. She sighed quietly after entering the same information incorrectly for the third time. A younger classmate named Brooke leaned over. "You skipped this menu." Sandra smiled gratefully. "Thank you." "No problem." Brooke shrugged. "My mom still asks me how to send pictures from her phone." Sandra laughed. "I finally found someone younger than my mistakes." The room filled with gentle laughter. The tension disappeared. Sandra realized something important. Nobody expected perfection. They expected progress. After class, Kevin called her aside. "Walk with me." They crossed the empty simulation lab together. Rows of stainless steel workstations reflected the fluorescent lights. Everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh cardboard packaging. Kevin stopped beside one of the instrument tables. "You know why I became an instructor." Sandra shook her head. "I almost quit this profession." She looked surprised. "You?" He nodded. "My first supervisor convinced me I'd never be good enough." "What changed?" "Another supervisor looked at my mistakes and said something I'll never forget." Kevin smiled at the memory. "Skill grows where shame ends." Sandra repeated the sentence quietly. "Skill grows where shame ends." "I've tried teaching that way ever since." He looked directly at her. "You're carrying too much shame." Sandra stared down at the polished floor. "I lost everything." "No," Kevin answered gently. "You lost a job. You lost a home. Those things matter. But they aren't everything." She didn't answer, because part of her still believed they were. 3 days later, the class took its first practical examination. Students had 45 minutes to inspect, assemble, package, and document a complete orthopedic instrument set. Sandra's hands trembled before the timer even started. She closed her eyes. Breathe. One tray, one instrument at a time, nothing else. The timer began. At first, her movements felt slow. Then muscle memory quietly returned. She checked every hinge, every locking mechanism, every cutting edge, just as she had done hundreds of times years earlier. When time expired, she looked around. Most students still examined their final trays. Sandra had finished 2 minutes early. Not because she rushed, because her hands finally remembered who they had once been. Kevin reviewed each tray without revealing scores. When he reached Sandra's workstation, he paused. He lifted one instrument, turned it over, smiled almost imperceptibly, then continued. Sandra couldn't read his expression. She spent the entire drive home imagining every possible mistake. That night, the temperature dropped below 20 degrees. The Explorer's windows frosted from the inside. Sandra layered blankets carefully around the children. Mason coughed twice before settling down. She checked his inhaler again. Still enough medication, barely. Emma unfolded another square of paper. "What color tonight?" Sandra looked upward. Nearly every space on the ceiling held a star. White, like the snow. Exactly. Emma folded patiently, while Caleb finished math homework beside the battery lantern. After hanging the new star, Emma whispered, "Every tomorrow deserves another star." Sandra looked at the growing constellation. One day, she thought, we'll have a real ceiling again. I wonder if we'll miss these stars. The answer surprised her. Yes, she probably would, because they represented every night they had refused to give up. The following afternoon, Angela Ruiz stopped Sandra in the hallway. "Eleanor would like to see you." Sandra immediately felt nervous. "Did I do something wrong?" Angela smiled. "If you had, Kevin would have found you first." That didn't completely ease her mind. She knocked gently on Eleanor's office door. "Come in." Eleanor motioned toward the chair opposite her desk. "How are classes?" "Hard." "Good." Sandra laughed softly. "I guess that's the right answer." "It usually is." Eleanor slid a folder across the desk. "I wanted to show you something." Inside were employment statistics, graduation rates, hospital partnerships. Sandra studied the pages. "I don't understand." "I want you to see where you're headed." Sandra looked up. "What if I don't make it?" Eleanor folded her hands. "Then we'll figure out why. And try again." Sandra blinked. "You'd let me." "I've never confused failure with finality." The words settled deeply inside her. Failure with finality. She had been treating them as the same thing for over a year. Before leaving, Sandra hesitated near the office door. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Who told you about me?" Eleanor became very quiet. "I can't answer that." "Why?" "Because the person who called wasn't asking for recognition." Sandra frowned slightly. "Was it someone from the hospital?" Eleanor smiled. "I can tell you this. The person saw your dignity before your circumstances and believed that mattered." Sandra thanked her politely, but the question stayed with her. Who had noticed she had spent months trying not to be noticed at all? That Friday evening, Mason needed another routine asthma check. Nothing serious, just a follow-up appointment. Dr. Michael Carter entered the examination room carrying Mason's updated chart. "Hello again." Mason grinned. "I only coughed a little." "I heard." Michael examined him carefully. The lung sounded better than the previous visit. "You're doing well." Sandra smiled with obvious relief. "Thank you." As Michael prepared to leave, Sandra spoke unexpectedly. "Doctor." He turned. "I've been meaning to ask you something." "Go ahead." She hesitated. "Have we met before all of this?" Michael looked genuinely puzzled. "I don't think so. You just—" She searched for the right words. "You always seem to look at us differently." Michael understood immediately. He chose his answer carefully. "My mother taught me something." Sandra waited. "When someone walks into a hospital, they usually bring more than the illness written on their chart." He smiled gently. "I try not to forget that." Sandra nodded slowly. "That's a good lesson." "It saved my life," Michael replied quietly. Before Sandra could ask what he meant, another emergency pager sounded from the hallway. He apologized. "I have to go," she smiled. "Thank you, doctor." As he disappeared through the door, Sandra watched him for a moment longer. There was something familiar about the sadness behind his calm expression. She couldn't explain why. Meanwhile, Michael walked briskly toward the trauma bay, but his thoughts lingered behind. He hadn't lied. His mother really had taught him that lesson. She had learned it while raising a little boy from the front seat of an old station wagon. And every time he looked at Sandra Anderson, he saw not only the woman she was fighting to become, he also saw the woman who had once kept his own future alive without ever realizing it. By early December, Sandra's days had become so carefully organized that every hour seemed borrowed from the next. She woke at 5:00 a.m., folded blankets, checked Mason's breathing, drove to the church, prepared breakfast, dropped the children at school, attended training, applied for part-time work during lunch breaks, picked the children up, helped with homework, studied late into the night beneath the small battery lantern inside the Explorer. Sleep became something she accepted rather than enjoyed. Yet something remarkable had begun to happen. She no longer woke wondering whether life would ever improve. She woke wondering what she needed to accomplish that day. The difference was small. It changed everything. Kevin announced the final practical assessment 2 weeks before Christmas. "This isn't your certification exam," he explained to the class, "but it will determine your clinical placements." The room immediately grew quieter. Students understood the importance. Hospitals often hired directly from successful internships. One strong placement could become a permanent career. One poor performance could delay everything. Sandra copied every instruction into her notebook. Brooke leaned toward her. "Nervous? A little." "Liar." Sandra laughed. "A lot." "So am I," Brooke admitted. "It helps knowing I'm not the only one." Sandra smiled. "You're definitely not." The practical assessment lasted nearly 4 hours. Students rotated through different stations: instrument identification, packaging, sterilization documentation, quality inspection, emergency contamination procedures. Sandra felt confident during the first 2 stations. The third proved more difficult. One tray contained a deliberately misplaced instrument. Most students overlooked it. Sandra almost did too. She reached for the packaging material, then stopped. Something felt wrong. She couldn't explain why. The tray simply didn't look balanced. She emptied the entire set and began again. Kevin observed silently from across the room. Sandra checked every inventory list, every diagram. Finally, she found it. A small vascular clamp had been substituted for a nearly identical instrument used in orthopedic surgery. The difference measured less than half an inch, enough to create serious problems in an operating room. She quietly replaced it, continued working, never realizing she had been the only student to catch the mistake. Later that afternoon, Kevin called everyone together. "I'd like to discuss today's hidden error." Several students looked confused. Brooke raised her hand. There was an error. Kevin smiled. "Exactly." He held up the incorrect clamp. This was intentionally placed inside one tray. The room became completely silent. Only one person identified it. He looked towards Sandra. "Miss Anderson." Sandra felt every eye turn toward her. She wished they hadn't. Kevin continued. "Do you know why she found it?" Nobody answered. "Not because she's lucky. Not because she's older. Because she never stopped respecting small details." He held up both clamps side by side. "In surgery, details become lives." Sandra lowered her eyes. Praise still felt unfamiliar. Kevin wasn't finished. Technical skills can be taught. Attention can be practiced. But responsibility, he looked directly at Sandra, is a habit. The class applauded softly. Brooke leaned over. "You earned that." Sandra whispered back, "We all will." She genuinely believed it. 3 days later, clinical placements were announced. Angela posted the list outside the administrative office. Students crowded around immediately. Sandra stayed behind. She had never enjoyed opening test results in public. Brooke pushed through the crowd. "Sandra?" Sandra looked up. "You got Riverside." She blinked. "Riverside? Your old hospital." For several seconds, she couldn't move. Returning there had never crossed her mind. She slowly walked to the list herself. There it was. Sandra Anderson. Riverside Regional Medical Center. Sterile processing clinical rotation. Starting January 6th. Her fingers lightly touched the paper. She wasn't just returning to healthcare. She was returning to the very place where she believed her career had ended. That evening, she sat alone inside the Explorer after the children fell asleep. The placement letter rested on her lap. She should have felt excited. Instead, she felt afraid. What if former coworkers remembered her? What if they pitied her? What if they asked questions she couldn't answer? She closed her eyes. The memories returned vividly. Cleaning out the cardboard box, handing over her employee badge, walking through the employee exit believing she'd never return. Now she would walk back through those same doors. As a trainee, not as an employee. Not yet. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. She looked up. Dr. Michael Carter stood outside the driver's window holding 2 paper cups. Sandra quickly rolled the window down a few inches. "I'm sorry." Michael smiled apologetically. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No. I was just reading." He lifted 1 cup. "I was leaving after my shift." The coffee machine made 2. Sandra laughed softly. "I've heard that excuse before." "So have I," he admitted. "It's still worth trying." She accepted the cup. The warmth spread instantly through her cold hands. "Thank you." For a few moments they simply stood in comfortable silence. Snowflakes drifted slowly beneath the parking lot lights. Michael finally spoke. "I heard something today." Sandra looked surprised. "What?" "Congratulations." She frowned. "For what?" "Your clinical placement." She smiled despite herself. "You know, the hospital education office circulates placement schedules." He nodded. "You'll be coming back." Sandra looked down at the coffee. "I'm not sure how I feel." Michael understood. "I was terrified the first time I came back here, too." She looked at him curiously. "You worked here before." He smiled. "As a resident. I left for several years. When I returned," he looked toward the emergency entrance, "and I felt like everyone remembered my mistakes." "Did they?" "No. They remembered whether I treated people well." Sandra absorbed those words quietly. "I keep thinking about losing my job." Michael nodded. "That's natural. But may I offer another way to think about it?" She waited. "The building remembers your work, not your worst day." Sandra stared at him. He couldn't possibly know how much she needed to hear exactly that sentence. Before she could thank him, Michael added one more thought. When people dedicate themselves to caring for others, they usually underestimate how many people noticed. Sandra smiled faintly. "I hope you're right." "I know I am," he answered gently. Then he wished her good night and walked toward his car. Sandra watched him disappear into the falling snow. There was kindness in him that seemed older than the moment itself, as though every encouraging word came from somewhere deeply personal. The next week passed quickly. Sandra completed the remaining classroom requirements. Her final written examination ended with a score of 96%, highest in the cohort. She stared at the results in disbelief. Not because she doubted the grade, because she remembered the woman who had sat crying inside the Explorer only weeks earlier, wondering if she had forgotten everything. Kevin shook her hand. "I knew you'd find your rhythm." Sandra smiled. "I almost quit before I started." "I'm glad you didn't." "So am I." That evening, Emma folded another paper star. The ceiling had almost no empty spaces left. She looked around thoughtfully. "We're running out of room." Sandra smiled. "Maybe that's a good problem." "Why?" "Because it means we won't need this ceiling forever." Emma looked up at the hundreds of colorful stars swaying gently above them. She nodded. "Then when we get our new home," she carefully pressed the newest star into the final open space, "we'll start covering another ceiling." Sandra reached back and squeezed her daughter's hand. Outside, snow continued to fall over Columbus. Inside the old Explorer, every inch of the ceiling now shimmered with handmade stars. There was no more room above them. Only the road ahead. The first Monday of January arrived with a bitter wind that swept across Columbus before sunrise. Sandra parked the Ford Explorer in the employee lot of Riverside Regional Medical Center 15 minutes earlier than necessary. For several moments, she simply sat behind the steering wheel. The hospital looked exactly as she remembered. The same brick entrance, the same revolving doors, the same emergency department sign glowing softly against the pale winter sky. Only one thing had changed. Last time she'd walked through those doors carrying a cardboard box filled with the remains of a career. Today, she carried a backpack, a notebook, and another chance. She rested both hands on the steering wheel. "I can do this." The words barely rose above a whisper. Emma leaned forward from the back seat. "You already can." Sandra turned and smiled. "When did you wake up?" "I wasn't asleep." Caleb grinned. "We all heard you." Mason hugged his blue dinosaur. "Mom's going back to work." Sandra laughed softly. "Not work. Training." Caleb shook his head. "No. You've already done the hard part." Sandra looked at her children for a long moment. There were mornings when she wondered how she kept them going. Today, she realized something else. Sometimes they were the ones carrying her. Angela had arranged temporary morning childcare before school hours. After hugging the children goodbye, Sandra walked alone towards the hospital entrance. Her employee badge looked different from the one she had surrendered months earlier. The word trainee appeared beneath her name. She expected the title to make her feel small. Instead, it reminded her she was moving forward. Inside the sterile processing department, familiar sounds greeted her. Steam sterilizers hummed steadily. Metal trays clicked against stainless steel counters. Packaging paper rustled softly. The scent of disinfectant filled the air. Home. Not because it was comfortable, because it was meaningful. Kevin Turner waited beside the department supervisor. "Sandra." "Welcome back." She smiled nervously. "It's good to be here." The supervisor, Linda Matthews, extended her hand. "I've heard wonderful things about you." Sandra blinked. "You have?" Linda nodded. "Some from Kevin. Some from people who worked with you before." Sandra hadn't expected anyone to remember. "I hope I don't disappoint." Linda smiled. "That's impossible. Today, your only job is to learn how we've changed." The morning passed faster than she imagined. Several procedures had been updated. Tracking software had improved. Packaging standards had become more precise. Sandra filled pages with notes. Every question she asked received a patient answer. Nobody treated her like an outsider. That surprised her more than anything else. During lunch break, she entered the employee cafeteria carrying a homemade peanut butter sandwich. She hesitated near the doorway. Years ago, she had eaten here almost every afternoon. Would anyone recognize her before she could decide where to sit? A familiar voice called her name. "Sandra." She turned. Maria Jenkins, one of the operating room nurses, stood holding a coffee tray. Maria's face lit up. "I knew that was you." Before Sandra could respond, Maria wrapped her in a warm hug. "We've missed you." Sandra laughed in surprise. "I thought everyone had forgotten." Maria pulled back. "Forgotten?" She looked genuinely confused. "You saved me more times than I can count." Sandra frowned. "I did. You always caught missing instruments before surgery." Maria smiled. "You made my job easier." Sandra had never thought anyone noticed. Apparently they had. Word spread surprisingly quickly. Throughout the afternoon, several former co-workers stopped by. Some stayed only long enough to wave. Others asked about the children. Nobody asked why she had disappeared. Nobody asked where she lived. They welcomed her back exactly where she stood. Sandra realized she had spent months fearing a conversation that never happened. Late that afternoon, she received her first independent assignment. A complex cardiovascular instrument set needed a complete inspection before sterilization. Linda handed her the documentation. "Take your time," Sandra nodded. She began exactly as she always had. Inventory first. Visual inspection, hinges, alignment, function. One instrument immediately caught her attention. A fine vascular scissors showed microscopic damage near the tip, almost invisible. She held it beneath a stronger light. There it was, a tiny chip, enough to compromise delicate tissue during surgery. She removed it from the tray and completed the replacement documentation. Linda reviewed the work a few minutes later. "You caught that," Sandra nodded. "It didn't feel right." Linda smiled knowingly. "I've heard that phrase before." Sandra looked puzzled. "Who said it?" "You did." Linda laughed softly. "Years ago." Sandra couldn't remember. Linda continued. "You once told a new technician that instruments speak quietly." Sandra smiled with embarrassment. "I actually said that." "You did." And apparently we all remembered. Sandra looked down at the tray. Perhaps experience really did leave fingerprints long after people walked away. Meanwhile, life inside the Explorer continued. Every evening, Sandra still returned to the same parking lot. Clinical training didn't magically produce an apartment. The children still completed homework beneath the battery lantern. Blankets still covered the back seats. The stars still covered every inch of the ceiling. One evening, Mason looked around. "It feels smaller." Caleb laughed. "Because we have books everywhere." Emma carefully stacked notebooks into plastic bins. "We'll need a bigger place for Mom's homework." Sandra smiled. "I hope so." Then her smile faded slightly. Money remained painfully tight. The training stipend barely covered fuel. Temporary assistance paid for part of the childcare. There was still no room for unexpected expenses. The next morning, the Explorer made a strange grinding noise while starting. Sandra froze. Not again. The engine finally turned over, but the sound lingered in her mind throughout the day. During lunch, she quietly searched repair costs online. Transmission, starter, alternator. Every possibility looked expensive. She closed the browser before panic could take hold. One problem at a time. Always one problem at a time. At the end of her second week, Kevin found her completing documentation after everyone else had left. "You always stay late," Sandra smiled. I always check everything twice." Kevin leaned against the counter. "I wanted to tell you something." She looked up. "We've completed your midpoint evaluation." Sandra waited. He handed her the report. Outstanding attention to detail, excellent procedural accuracy, professional communication, highly recommended for permanent placement. Sandra read the final line twice, highly recommended. Her eyes filled unexpectedly. Kevin pretended not to notice. "You earned every word." She looked up. "I don't know how to thank everyone." Kevin shook his head. "Don't. Just keep doing what you've always done." "And what's that?" He smiled. "Treat every instrument like someone's future depends on it." Sandra answered softly, "Because it does." Kevin nodded. "Exactly." That evening, the children insisted on celebrating. Their celebration consisted of microwave popcorn heated in the church kitchen and shared inside the Explorer. Emma produced another sheet of paper. "There isn't any room left." Sandra looked up. Every inch of the ceiling sparkled with colorful stars. Caleb pointed toward the driver's visor. "There's one spot Emma carefully folded a bright silver star. She taped it above Sandra's seat. This one watches over Mom. Mason smiled sleepily. So, she remembers to come home. Sandra reached up and touched the little silver star. Then she looked at her children. I always will. For the first time in many months, those words no longer sounded like hope alone. They sounded like a promise she was finally beginning to believe she could keep. By the end of January, Sandra no longer counted her progress in days. She counted it in routines she had reclaimed. She no longer felt like a visitor walking through Riverside Regional Medical Center. She knew which sterilizer reached temperature first every morning. She knew which supply cart always squeaked near the loading dock. She knew exactly how Linda Matthews liked documentation organized before the afternoon shift. Familiarity slowly replaced fear. Every completed tray reminded her that competence had been waiting beneath grief all along. Yet, when each shift ended, she still crossed the parking lot toward the same aging blue Ford Explorer. The contrast never escaped her. Inside the hospital, she was respected. Outside, she was still homeless. She refused to let either reality erase the other. One Thursday afternoon, Linda asked Sandra to stay after the shift. Sandra immediately wondered whether she had made a mistake. Instead, Linda handed her a clipboard. I need a favor. Sandra glanced at the schedule. A new clinical trainee would begin on Monday. Train someone. Linda smiled. Only during her first week. Sandra blinked. Are you sure? I wouldn't ask if I weren't. Sandra hesitated. I'm still a trainee myself. Linda folded her arms. Technically, but experience isn't measured only by paperwork. Sandra accepted the clipboard slowly. I'll do my best. I know you will. The new trainee arrived exactly at 7 Monday morning. Her name was Jasmine Reed. 24 years old, recently graduated from a community college. Bright, energetic, terrified, Sandra recognized the look immediately. Jasmine apologized 3 times before lunch. I'm sorry, I have never done this before. I'm sorry. I think I slowed everyone down. Sandra smiled patiently. You know how many times I apologized my first week? Jasmine looked hopeful. How many? I lost count. Both women laughed. Sandra showed her how to inspect locking mechanisms without rushing, how to organize instruments before checking inventory, how to pause whenever something felt wrong, even before knowing why. Jasmine listened carefully. You make it look easy. Sandra shook her head. No, I make it look familiar. There's a difference. During the lunch break, Jasmine asked a question Sandra hadn't expected. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask. You don't have to answer. Sandra nodded. Fair enough. Were you always this confident? Sandra nearly laughed. If you'd met me 3 months ago. She stopped herself. You wouldn't be asking that. Jasmine looked surprised. What changed? Sandra thought for a long moment before answering. I stopped measuring myself by everything I'd lost, and started measuring myself by what I could still give. Jasmine quietly repeated the sentence into her notebook. Sandra noticed. Don't write down everything I say. Jasmine grinned. My grandmother says wisdom disappears if nobody remembers it. Sandra smiled. Your grandmother sounds smart. She is. That evening, Sandra arrived at the church later than usual. Pastor William noticed the smile she couldn't quite hide. Good day. The best one in a long time. He poured another bowl of soup. I thought so. How? You greeted everyone before they greeted you. Sandra laughed. I guess I did. Emma climbed onto the bench beside her. Mom taught someone today. Sandra looked surprised. How did you know? You smile differently when you help people. Children observed more than adults realized. Caleb looked up from his homework. I think that's true. Sandra shook her head playfully. When did all of you become psychologists? We've been studying you for years, Caleb answered. The whole table burst into laughter. For a few precious moments, the church dining hall felt less like a place of necessity and more like a family kitchen. The following Friday, Eleanor Brooks invited Sandra back to the training center. Not for classes, for coffee. Sandra arrived still wearing her Riverside badge. Eleanor noticed it immediately. You kept it on. Sandra looked down. I forgot. No? Eleanor smiled. I don't think you did. They sat near a window overlooking the simulation lab. New students practiced wrapping surgical trays below. Eleanor stirred her tea slowly. How's Riverside? Sandra's face softened. It feels, she searched for the right word, like finding an old part of myself. Eleanor nodded. I hoped it would. Sandra looked out the window. I still sleep in my car, I know. I still worry every night, I know. I still don't know how I'll afford an apartment. I know, Sandra sighed. So why do I feel happier? Eleanor smiled gently, because hope is easier to carry than fear. Silence settled comfortably between them. After a while, Eleanor spoke again. May I tell you something? Please. When Michael Carter called me, Sandra looked up immediately. So it was him. Eleanor smiled, but neither confirmed nor denied the assumption. She continued carefully. The person who contacted me didn't ask me to rescue anyone. He asked me to notice someone. Sandra listened quietly. There's an important difference. Sandra nodded slowly. I understand. You weren't looking for charity. No. I was looking for a way back. On her way out, Sandra paused beside the hallway known as the Star Corridor. Every graduate of the program wrote a short message on a paper star before accepting their first healthcare position. Hundreds of colorful stars covered one wall. Some messages were only a few words. For my daughter. We made it. Second chances exist. My father would be proud. Sandra stood there for several minutes. Angela Ruiz walked up beside her. Beautiful, isn't it? It is. Angela handed her a blank paper star. You don't graduate until next month. Sandra looked confused. I know, but I thought you might want to think about what you'll write. Sandra turned the blank star over in her hands. Empty, waiting. Much like tomorrow. That weekend, an unexpected snowstorm covered Columbus. Schools closed on Monday. Sandra worried immediately about childcare. Before she could call Angela, her phone rang. It was Jasmine. I heard the schools closed. They did. I know this is short notice, Sandra began. Jasmine interrupted. My grandmother said to bring the kids to our house. Sandra froze. What? She watches my little cousins anyway. I can't ask you to do that. You didn't. Jasmine smiled through the phone. I'm offering. Sandra looked at the sleeping children in the back of the Explorer. Emotion tightened her throat. I don't know how to thank you. My grandmother already told me. What did she say? Someone helped your teacher once. Now it's your turn. Sandra closed her eyes. The words settled deep inside her heart. She had spent months believing kindness moved in straight lines, one person helping another. Now she was beginning to see the truth. Kindness moved in circles. It kept returning, changing faces, changing voices, never changing its purpose. That night, after the children fell asleep, Emma folded another paper star, even though there was no room left on the ceiling. Instead, she tucked it carefully into Sandra's training folder. Why there? Sandra whispered. Emma smiled sleepily. So, when someone else needs hope, she yawned. You'll already have one ready. Sandra kissed her daughter's forehead. Outside, snow continued falling silently across the city. Inside, the old explorer, surrounded by books, blankets, and a family that refused to surrender, Sandra realized something she had never fully understood before. She had entered the training program believing she was learning how to rebuild a career. Without noticing it, she had also begun learning how hope passed quietly from one pair of hands to another. February arrived carrying a different kind of cold. The air outside still stung exposed skin, but something inside Sandra no longer felt frozen. She had stopped introducing herself as someone who used to work in healthcare. She had become someone working in healthcare again. The distinction mattered. Every morning, she clipped her trainee badge onto her navy blue scrub top before looking in the rearview mirror of the Explorer. For months, that mirror had reflected exhaustion. Now it reflected purpose. The circumstances surrounding her family had not changed nearly as quickly as her confidence. The children still slept inside the SUV. Bills still arrived. The old engine still groaned every morning before finally starting. But Sandra had begun planning months ahead instead of merely surviving until tomorrow. Hope had quietly become part of her routine. One Friday afternoon, Linda Matthews approached Sandra just before the end of her shift. Do you have a minute? Of course. Linda closed the office door behind them. I received a phone call this morning. Sandra's stomach tightened. Is something wrong? No, Linda smiled. Actually, something is very right. She slid a printed evaluation across the desk. Across the top appeared the logo of the Ohio Healthcare Network. Sandra immediately recognized the document. It summarized her clinical performance. She skimmed the first paragraph. Outstanding procedural accuracy. Exceptional professionalism. Highly recommended for immediate employment. Sandra stopped reading. She looked back at Linda. I've never received comments like these. Linda folded her hands. You've earned every sentence. Sandra swallowed hard. I still have 2 weeks left. I know. Linda nodded. Which is why Human Resources called. Sandra stared. They don't usually contact us before clinical rotations finish. Sandra waited. They're asking whether we'd like to offer you a permanent position. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Sandra blinked once. Then again, I'm sorry. She whispered, I don't think I heard you correctly. Linda laughed softly. They'd like to hire you. Sandra covered her mouth with one hand. The words refused to settle. After everything that had happened, after every rejection, after every application that disappeared into silence, someone was offering her a job before she'd even completed training. Tears blurred the evaluation in front of her. Linda handed her a tissue. I've seen this reaction before. Sandra smiled through tears. I promised myself I wouldn't cry at work. That's one promise you're allowed to break. Human Resources scheduled the interview for the following Tuesday. Sandra almost laughed when she received the email. An interview. At the same hospital that had once laid her off. The irony wasn't lost on her. That evening, she told the children while sharing spaghetti served at the church community dinner. Emma nearly dropped her fork. You have another interview, Sandra nodded. But, Emma looked confused. You already work there. Not permanently. Caleb understood immediately. They want to keep you. Sandra smiled. I hope so. Mason raised both hands excitedly. Does that mean pancakes? Everyone looked at him. What? When happy things happen. He shrugged innocently. We eat pancakes. The table erupted with laughter. Sandra hadn't realized he remembered. Years earlier, before everything fell apart, she had always made pancakes to celebrate birthdays, report cards, and good news. Some traditions survived even homelessness. I think pancakes are a wonderful idea. The interview lasted only 23 minutes. Sandra wore the same navy blazer she had worn to nearly every unsuccessful interview over the previous year. She had carefully repaired a loose button the night before. As she waited outside the conference room, she recognized one member of the hiring panel, Director of Surgical Services, Karen Mitchell. Karen smiled the moment she saw Sandra. "It's good to see you again." "You too." The interview itself felt surprisingly different from every other one. Nobody questioned employment gaps with suspicion. Nobody asked why she had needed retraining. Instead, they asked practical questions. How would she mentor newer technicians? How did she organize priorities during busy shifts? What had changed in sterilization standards since she had last worked full-time? Sandra answered honestly. She admitted what she still needed to learn. She explained what experience had taught her. She never tried to sound impressive. She simply sounded truthful. When the interview ended, Karen walked her toward the door. "One last question." Sandra nodded. "What made you decide to come back?" Sandra thought quietly before answering. "I remembered that this work isn't just about instruments." Karen waited. "It's about patients who never know our names." She smiled. "I missed protecting people who never realized I was helping them." Karen's eyes softened. "That's a beautiful answer." 3 days later, Sandra received another phone call. She recognized the hospital number immediately. Her hands trembled before answering. "This is Sandra." "Hello, Sandra." It was Karen Mitchell. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Sandra looked toward the children studying together inside the library. "Not at all." Karen laughed gently. "I'll keep this simple. We'd be honored to welcome you back to Riverside Regional Medical Center as a full-time sterile processing technician." Sandra closed her eyes. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Karen continued, "Your benefits begin immediately. Health insurance, retirement, paid leave. The official letter has already been emailed." Sandra finally managed to whisper, "Thank you." "No," Karen replied warmly. "Thank you for coming home." The children knew before Sandra said a word. She climbed into the Explorer smiling so widely that Emma gasped. "You got it." Sandra nodded. Caleb quietly closed his math notebook. Mason bounced in his seat. "Pancakes." Sandra laughed so hard tears rolled down her face. "Yes, pancakes." That evening, they celebrated with a pancake dinner at the church kitchen. Pastor William insisted on making them himself. "They're a little uneven." He apologized. Emma took one bite. "They're perfect." Everyone agreed. For one evening, nobody thought about parking lots or unpaid bills. They simply celebrated. 2 days later, Eleanor invited Sandra to visit the training center one more time. "I have someone who'd like to see you." Sandra assumed it might be Kevin or Angela. Instead, she found Dr. Michael Carter standing beside the window overlooking the simulation lab. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Michael smiled first. "Congratulations." Sandra smiled back. "You knew." "I had a feeling." She looked at him carefully. "It was you." Michael tilted his head slightly. "What was the phone call?" He remained silent. Sandra continued. "Eleanor never said your name." "She didn't have to." Michael walked slowly toward the window. "I wasn't trying to change your life. I was trying to introduce you to someone who might." Sandra stepped beside him. "Why?" He looked out across the training floor where another class practiced assembling surgical trays. "Would you like to hear a story?" Sandra nodded. Michael took a slow breath. "When I was 9 years old," he paused, "my mother and I lived inside an old station wagon." Sandra turned toward him. He continued quietly. "My father left. My mother lost her job. We slept in parking lots. We washed up in church restrooms. Sandra felt tears gathering before he even reached the end. One afternoon, Michael smiled faintly, a social worker named Eleanor Brooks found my mother. Sandra stared. She didn't hand us money. She found my mother a training program. A few months later, we had an apartment. A year later, my mother was working again. Sandra whispered, "So when you saw us?" Michael nodded. "I didn't see strangers. I saw my own childhood." Silence settled between them. Finally, Sandra asked the question she had carried for months. "Why didn't you tell me?" Michael smiled gently. "Because the story wasn't supposed to become about me." "It was supposed to become about you," Sandra wiped away a tear. "I thought you saved us." Michael shook his head. "No. You did something much harder." "What?" "You accepted the opportunity." He looked directly into her eyes. "Many people can open a door, but only the person standing outside it can choose to walk through." Sandra looked down at her hands. For the first time since losing everything, she understood the full truth. The phone call had started the journey. Her courage had carried it the rest of the way. And somewhere above them, hanging in the training center hallway, hundreds of colorful paper stars gently moved in the warm air, waiting for the next story to begin. Sandra's first official day as a full-time employee arrived on the first Monday of March. She stood in the employee locker room, staring at the new identification badge resting in her hands. The word trainee was gone. Beneath her name now appeared only her title: Sterile Processing Technician. Nothing about the badge looked extraordinary. To Sandra, it felt heavier than gold. She clipped it onto her scrub top, took one deep breath, and caught her reflection in the locker room mirror. For the first time in nearly 2 years, she saw a woman whose future stretched farther than next week's gas money. Linda Matthews stepped into the hallway. "You ready?" Sandra smiled. "I think so." Linda laughed softly. "Good, because we're ready for you." Her first week passed almost too quickly. Instead of shadowing other technicians, Sandra now received her own assignments. She inspected hundreds of surgical instruments every day: orthopedic trays, cardiovascular sets, microsurgical equipment. Every instrument passed through her hands before reaching an operating room. She worked exactly as she always had. Deliberately, quietly, carefully. Nothing dramatic happened, no applause, no ceremony. She discovered something comforting. Meaningful work rarely announced itself. It simply needed to be done well. Near the end of the week, Linda stopped beside Sandra's workstation. "I have another favor." Sandra smiled. "I'm beginning to think that's becoming a habit." "It is." Linda handed her a thin folder. "Our next orientation group starts Monday." Sandra looked at the cover. "New Employee Mentoring Program." "I'd like you to help." Sandra hesitated. "I've only been officially hired for 5 days." Linda nodded. "And," Sandra laughed, "I thought mentors were supposed to know everything." Linda smiled knowingly. "No. They're supposed to remember what it felt like not to." That answer stayed with Sandra long after Linda walked away. The following Monday, she welcomed 4 new employees into the department. One had recently graduated from college. Another had transferred from a different hospital. The third had spent years in military health care. The fourth quietly stood near the back of the room. A woman in her early 40s. Her uniform looked immaculate. Her shoulders looked exhausted. Sandra noticed immediately. After orientation ended, she introduced herself. "I'm Sandra." The woman smiled politely. "Vanessa." "First day." Vanessa nodded. "First healthcare job." "You'll do fine." "I hope so." Vanessa looked around before lowering her voice. "I almost didn't come." Sandra heard something hidden beneath the words. "What changed your mind?" Vanessa hesitated. "I've been living in a motel with my son." Sandra didn't react with surprise. She simply listened. "I kept thinking," Vanessa swallowed. "Maybe people like me don't belong in hospitals." Sandra smiled gently. "I know someone who thought that once." Vanessa looked up. "What happened to her?" Sandra reached toward a nearby instrument tray. "She learned that hospitals need people with steady hands." She paused. "And steady hearts." Vanessa smiled through tears. Neither woman said anything else. They didn't need to. Sometimes recognition arrived quietly. That evening, Sandra drove toward the familiar church parking lot out of habit. Halfway there, she suddenly remembered. She didn't need to. 3 days earlier, she had signed the lease for a small apartment only 15 minutes from Riverside. The apartment wasn't large. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, old carpeting, white walls waiting for pictures. The refrigerator hummed louder than necessary. The kitchen window overlooked another parking lot. It was perfect, because it belonged to them. Emma still couldn't believe it. The first night, she had walked from room to room, touching every wall. "So many ceilings," she whispered. "So many." Mason insisted on sleeping on the floor despite having a real bed. "It feels funny," he admitted. Caleb unpacked books before unpacking clothes. Sandra stood quietly in the kitchen watching all 3 children move through rooms that finally echoed with safety instead of uncertainty. She didn't unpack immediately. Instead, she walked back outside. The blue Ford Explorer remained parked beside the building. She rested one hand against its worn hood. "You carried us," she whispered. The old vehicle answered only with silence. Yet, somehow, it felt like gratitude. The Explorer remained exactly where it was for another week. Friends suggested selling it. The money could help. Sandra always smiled. Not yet. One Saturday afternoon, the children climbed inside the parked SUV one final time. Nothing had changed. The paper stars still covered the ceiling. The battery lantern still rested beside the driver's seat. Blankets remained folded carefully in the back. Emma looked upward. "They're still beautiful." Sandra nodded. "They always will be." Caleb quietly reached into his backpack. "I found something." He removed the little spiral notebook. Every expense from the previous year filled its pages. Gas, laundry, medicine, food, repairs. Sandra turned slowly through the worn pages. Near the beginning, she found one familiar entry. "Home," crossed out. She looked at Caleb. "You remember this?" He nodded. "I finished it." He handed her a pen. Sandra looked confused. "What do you mean?" He pointed toward the empty space beside the old word. Slowly, Sandra wrote 2 new words. "Found again." Caleb smiled. "I think that's better." "So do I." A few days later, Sandra visited the training center to thank Eleanor one last time. Students filled the simulation labs. Another group had begun the same journey she once feared starting. Angela Ruiz greeted her with a hug. "You look different," Sandra laughed. "I sleep indoors." Angela smiled. "It shows." Eleanor invited Sandra into her office. "I have a question." Sandra sat down. "What is it?" Eleanor placed a small box on the desk. Inside were folded paper stars, blank, waiting. "We've been thinking," she began. "The star corridor keeps growing." Sandra nodded. "It's beautiful. But I think it needs something more." Eleanor slid the box toward her. "I'd like you to create a tradition." Sandra looked puzzled. "What kind of tradition?" "The first day every new student arrives." Eleanor smiled. "I'd like them to receive 1 paper star." Sandra slowly picked one up. And, uh, they won't write on it immediately. They'll carry it until graduation. When they finish, they'll write one sentence. Sandra turned the blank star between her fingers. What sentence? Anything. Eleanor answered, as long as it reminds someone else not to give up. Sandra felt emotion rising unexpectedly. I'd love to. That evening, before bedtime, Emma quietly entered the kitchen carrying colored paper. Sandra smiled. Another star? Emma nodded. This one's different. How? It isn't for us. She folded carefully, then handed it to her mother. Sandra opened it gently. Inside, Emma had written in uneven handwriting, "For whoever needs tomorrow more than today." Sandra hugged her tightly. I think, she whispered, that's the most beautiful one yet. Emma smiled. Can we take it to the school? Sandra nodded. We will. Outside the apartment window, evening settled gently across Columbus. Inside, warm light filled rooms that had once existed only in the family's imagination. The Explorer still waited in the parking lot below. The stars still covered its ceiling, but now, for the first time, they no longer pointed toward survival. They pointed toward the people still waiting for someone to believe in them, and Sandra knew exactly where the next star belonged. 5 years passed more quietly than Sandra Anderson had ever imagined possible. There were no dramatic headlines, no television interviews, no miracle lottery tickets. Life changed the way real lives often do through ordinary mornings, repeated often enough to become extraordinary. The small apartment eventually gave way to a modest 3-bedroom townhouse. Caleb graduated from high school with honors and earned a scholarship to study engineering. His old expense notebook remained tucked inside the top drawer of his desk. Every now and then he opened it not to remember hardship, but to remember what perseverance looked like in numbers and handwritten promises. Emma never stopped folding paper stars. She became known throughout her school as the girl with the stars. Teachers hung them in classrooms. Neighbors placed them on Christmas trees. Children in the pediatric wing of Riverside Regional Medical Center received one whenever they were frightened before surgery. Nobody knew exactly how the tradition had spread. Sandra did. Kindness rarely needed a map. It simply kept moving. Mason's asthma became easier to manage as he grew older. The blue dinosaur faded almost gray after years of hugs, still occupied a place of honor on the bookshelf in his bedroom. Whenever anyone suggested replacing it, he always smiled. Some things aren't supposed to be new. Sandra understood. Some memories deserved to grow old beside you. At Riverside, Sandra had become one of the department's most trusted technicians. New employees almost always spent part of their orientation working beside her. Linda Matthews often joked that Sandra could identify a missing instrument from across the room. Sandra always laughed. I still just look carefully. What surprised her most was how often young technicians asked questions that had little to do with sterilization. How do you stay calm? What do you do when you make a mistake? How do you keep going when life gets difficult? She answered each question honestly. Sometimes the answer involved hospital procedures. Sometimes it involved pancakes. Sometimes it involved paper stars. Most often, it involved simply refusing to confuse a difficult season with a permanent identity. The star corridors at the Central Ohio Medical Workforce Initiative had changed as well. Hundreds of stars had become thousands. Every graduate carried one through the entire program before writing a single sentence upon graduation. Visitors often spent nearly an hour reading them. I believed again. My children finally slept peacefully. I stopped apologizing for surviving. I remembered who I was. One star written in careful block letters simply read, "Someone noticed me." Sandra paused in front of that one every time she visited. It reminded her that entire lives could change because one person refused to look away. Odd. One crisp October evening, Sandra finished her shift just before sunset. The maple trees surrounding the hospital had turned brilliant shades of orange and red. She carried a travel mug of coffee toward her car when she noticed a familiar sight. A silver minivan sat alone near the far edge of the parking lot. Its windows had begun to fog from the inside. Something deep inside her stopped her feet before her mind understood why. She looked more closely. The van wasn't running. No one appeared to be getting out. Sandra stood still. 5 years earlier, someone else had done exactly the same thing. She didn't rush over. She didn't assume. She simply watched. After several moments, the driver's door opened. A young woman stepped outside carrying a sleeping toddler. She looked around carefully before settling the child back inside. Then she spread a blanket across the back seat. Sandra felt her heart tighten. She recognized every movement. Not because she had seen it, because she had lived it. She walked slowly toward the van, making sure not to startle the woman. "Excuse me." The young mother immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry." She spoke before Sandra asked anything. "We'll leave soon." Sandra smiled gently. "I'm not here to ask you to leave." The woman relaxed only slightly. Sandra noticed the exhaustion beneath her eyes, the careful way she kept smiling despite obvious fear. "What are their names?" Sandra asked quietly. The woman looked surprised. "My daughters." Sandra nodded. "Ava," she pointed toward the sleeping toddler, "and Chloe." The older little girl peeked nervously from beneath a blanket. Sandra crouched until they were eye level. "They're beautiful." The young mother swallowed hard. "Thank you." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, simply honest. Finally, the woman whispered, "I'm trying." Sandra nodded. "I know." The young mother stared. "You do. I really do." Sandra opened her purse. For just a moment, the woman stiffened, expecting money. Sandra reached past her wallet, past her keys. She removed something else. A folded paper star. Emma had insisted she keep several in her bag at all times, for whoever needs tomorrow more than today. Sandra gently placed the star into the woman's hand. The young mother looked confused. "It's empty," Sandra smiled. "It is. For now." Then Sandra reached into another pocket and removed a business card. Central Ohio Medical Workforce Initiative. The same organization that had once opened a door for her. "If you've ever worked in healthcare," Sandra said softly, "or if you've ever wanted to, call this number." The woman looked from the card to the paper star. "I don't understand." "You don't have to tonight," Sandra replied. "But when you're ready." She smiled through memories that suddenly felt very close. The door will still be there." The young mother's eyes filled with tears. "No one's talked to me like that." Sandra nodded. "I know, she truly did." The following week, Sandra stopped by the training center. Eleanor Brooks had officially retired 3 months earlier. Her office now belonged to Angela Ruiz. Nothing else seemed different. Students hurried between classrooms. Simulation labs buzzed with activity. Hope still echoed quietly through every hallway. Sandra walked to the star corridor. She carried one final paper star. Blank. She stood before the wall for several moments before writing carefully. The words came easily. Someone once looked through a fogged window and chose to see a future instead of a problem. She pinned the star beside thousands of others. Then she stepped back. Above her, colorful stars shifted gently in the warm air from the ventilation system. For one fleeting moment, they reminded her of another ceiling. An old blue Ford Explorer. 3 sleeping children. a flashlight balanced on her knee, a backpack waiting to be stitched, a doctor standing quietly in the rain. She smiled, not because those days had disappeared, but because they had become part of a story worth carrying. As she turned to leave, another class of students entered the hallway. Each one received a blank paper star. Each one held it with curiosity. Each one carried struggles no one else could fully see. Sandra watched them disappear into the classroom before walking toward the exit. Outside, autumn sunlight reflected from hospital windows across the street. People hurried to work. Parents held children's hands. Ambulances arrived. Life continued. And somewhere perhaps at that very moment, another exhausted mother was doing everything she could to protect her children without asking the world for pity. Sandra hoped someone would notice her. Sometimes the greatest act of kindness wasn't solving another person's problems. Sometimes it was looking closely enough to recognize their strength before they had forgotten it themselves. Every person you pass is carrying a story you may never hear. Some are fighting battles hidden behind clean clothes, polite smiles, or quiet determination. Sandra's journey reminds us that dignity doesn't disappear when life becomes difficult. Sometimes people don't need someone to rescue them. They need someone willing to see them believe in them and open a door they can walk through with their own courage. Real kindness isn't measured by how much money we give. It's measured by whether we leave another person with more hope than they had before meeting us. A small conversation, an introduction, an opportunity, or simply refusing to judge someone by their circumstances can change not only one life, but generations that follow. Just as one doctor's decision transformed Sandra's future, Sandra chose to pass that same opportunity to someone else. That's how compassion grows, one person at a time, one choice at a time. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Have you ever experienced a small act of kindness that changed your life forever? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might need to read it today. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about hope, resilience, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more inspiring journeys.